Good evening. My name is Ryan Dumont. I'm a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics here at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this evening's event. The Institute's mission is to engage, educate, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic, political parts of life, in their communities, and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political candidates or issues. Before we begin this evening's program, I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones. Introducing tonight's speaker is Professor Kyle Hubbard, an assistant professor of philosophy here at St. Anselm College. He received his Ph.D. from Fordham University. The professor teaches business ethics here at the college and serves as the advisor to the Ethics and Government Forum. After tonight's speaker concludes, there will be a brief question and answer session. Without further ado, Professor Kyle Hubbard.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, as Ryan mentioned, Kyle Hubbard, and teach business ethics here and also serve as an advisor for this program. And so the St. Anselm Ethics and Governance Forum is concerned, as the title indicates, with the intersection of ethics, business, governance, politics. The forum hosts 4 speakers annually, and we've already had one speaker earlier this semester in September, Max Baseman. We've got speakers yet to be determined in the spring, and so I encourage you, if you're interested in the program speakers that this forum will have, to visit the website. Ethics and Governance Forum can be found. Website can be found through the New Hampshire Institute of Politics page. We also, in addition to these 4 speakers, the forum also focuses on investor education, and we also have a nonprofit governance forum. I think the next event in that series is coming up next Tuesday. So if you are involved in nonprofits on any level, whether you work for a nonprofit or on a nonprofit board, it's a fantastic program to go through. It will help you think ethically through issues in nonprofit government. So I encourage you to check that out. So tonight we welcome Dr. Mary Gentile. And Dr. Gentile is professor of practice at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. She used to be at Babson College. And she's the creator and director of Giving Voice to Value, something we're going to be hearing about tonight, as well as numerous books, articles in the field of business ethics. As we will learn more about, Giving Voice to Values is a pioneering business curriculum for values-driven leadership, empowering business leaders with the skills to voice and act on their values and align their professional path with their principles. It's been piloted in over 900 business schools and organizations around the globe. It's been featured in publications such as the Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, McKinsey Quarterly. And following Dr. Gentile's presentation, she will be signing copies of her book over by Anne, which is, the book is Giving Voice to Values, How to Speak Your Mind When You Know What's Right. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gentile.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here tonight. I'm going to talk to you about Giving Voice to Values, or GVV, as I may refer to it. So if I lapse into acronyms, you'll know what I'm talking about. I want to thank Anne and Kyle and Ryan for the nice introductions and the invitation. As Kyle was saying to you, Giving Voice to Values is an innovative approach, a new approach to values-driven leadership development. It was created for use in business schools, but increasingly it's being used well beyond that. It's being used in business schools, but it's also being used in businesses themselves. I'd be happy to share some stories about that if there's some of you in the group who would like to talk about that. It's starting to be used in other professions, nursing, law, engineering, medicine. And also, we've worked with the U.S. military, we've worked with the Queensland Police Force in Australia, We've done work in Africa. It's being used on all 7 continents now, including the Antarctic. So I'd be happy to talk about any of that. But what I thought I'd do tonight is simply tell you some stories, which I hope will help you understand the Giving Voice to Values approach and what's different about it and what might be useful about it for your own lives and your own work. But before I begin, I want to give you sort of the punchline. So if at any point your day is out, it's 6 o'clock at night, and you might have low blood sugar. If you don't remember anything else from what I'm saying tonight, this is what I hope you will remember. This is the punchline. Giving voice to values is about asking and answering a different question, a new question when it comes to ethics and business and values-driven leadership. So instead of asking the traditional question, which is, what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? That's an important question, hugely important. It's one that has been addressed for millennia in ethics classes and in ethics research and reflection. But Giving Voice to Values asks a different question. We ask, once you know what you believe is right, how can you get it done effectively? What do you need to say, to whom, in what sequence, and then what will the pushback be? What will the objections be? And then what would you say? And what kind of data do you need to gather? And how will you need to perhaps reframe this situation? And is this something you're going to do alone? Or is this something where you really need to work in some kind of coalition or build allies, et cetera, et cetera? So it's really about the process of scripting and action planning for values-driven action. The reason that we've made that shift in the question is what I'm going to tell you about tonight. And I'm going to tell you about it through a series of stories. So to begin with, I like to explain to people that the development of Giving Voice to Values came out of my own personal crisis of faith. I've been working in the field of ethics and business education for several decades. I spent 10 years at Harvard Business School, where I helped design and teach their first required curriculum around ethics and leadership. And I left Harvard in the mid-90s and was consulting to a number of business schools and companies around the world. And then I went to Babson College, as Kyle mentioned. I was there for 6 years. And now I'm at the Darden School of Business in Virginia. But in the late 90s, around the turn of the last century, I had this crisis of faith. And I began to feel that, after several decades doing this work, that maybe trying to teach about ethics in business schools, maybe it was unethical. And I began to feel that way because it seemed that at best it was often futile, and at worst it really felt hypocritical sometimes. And there were a number of things that went into that conclusion or that reaction on my part. For example, as I said, I've been working in this field for several decades, and it seemed that every few years there'd be a spate of scandals that would hit the business press, right? In the 70s, there were the defense contractor scandals. In the 80s, there was the insider trading scandals. And we came into the 90s, and we had the dot-com bubble. And then later we had, Enron and WorldCom and Parmalat and Goldman Sachs and Galleon Group. And more recently, we've had Volkswagen and Wells Fargo, and, we can all go on. And if you happen to be working in a business school, whenever these sort of scandals would hit the press, it was kind of a predictable reaction. And I had lived through it several times. And it was basically that there would be a lot of articles in the business press that would be saying, what the heck are they teaching in business schools? Because it was usually, MBAs from top business schools who were on the front pages of the newspapers, being accused of various kinds of malpractice in these situations. And if you happened to be working in a business school, as I was, there were often, angry alumni who would be complaining about the devaluing of the brand. I remember being called into the dean's office at Harvard because there was an alumni who was writing to them and was very upset about the issues, but was also saying, look, if you can crack this, I will donate. We'll support you to figure out how to address these issues. So, there were a lot of these kinds of reactions, and every time this happened, we would, scurry around and look at the curriculum and interview the alumni and talk to the business community and talk to the students, and we'd create new courses, we'd hire new faculty, maybe we'd start a research institute, we'd send out all the press releases. And then a few years later, the whole cycle would start again. And I had lived through this cycle several times, and it was beginning to feel, like I say, a little futile. Another reason for my crisis of faith was actually around that time, I had a good friend, Kirk Hansen, who he's still running the Center for Professional Ethics at Santa Clara University. And around that time, he decided he was going to host a debate. And he wanted to have two people on one side of the debate who'd be arguing that, you know, after 25 years of good faith effort, we've made a huge amount of progress. We're going to try and teach about ethics in business schools and prepare people for ethical business careers. And on the other side of the debate, he wanted to have two people who'd be arguing that we've made no progress. And on this side of the debate, he had Milton Friedman's son, who was also an economist. And on the side of the debate saying we've made a lot of progress, he asked me to be one of the people on that side. And so it was one of those watershed moments, right? Because I sat down to write my remarks, bless you, and I started thinking, what can I honestly say? You know? And I felt that, you know, this is an ethics panel. Can I lie? You know, I wasn't really sure. But what I ended up saying, I kind of came up with a sort of nuanced position where I said, you know, any of us who are educators know that there are individuals that we have had an impact on. But if I really am going to be honest, I don't think we've had a broader kind of impact. That wasn't really what he'd hoped I would say, but it was honest, you know. But it was also one of the, like I say, a watershed moment, because I thought, gee, after, you know, a couple decades doing this, is that the best I can say, you know? And it was a little sobering. But I guess the biggest reason for my crisis of faith is what I actually saw in the classroom, you know, with students, or when I was in organizations, what I would see in rooms full of executives and managers. And it was this, that whenever we tried to have a conversation about business ethics, we would typically give people some sort of case study, you know, some sort of thorny ethical dilemma to consider. And they would read it, and they would come into the room, and they'd usually come into the room with an idea of what they thought the right thing to do was. But then in the course of the case discussion, two things would happen. The first thing that would happen is that their thinking would become more complex, right? They'd realize that maybe they hadn't had all the information. And, you know, or, you know, maybe this is just how it's done in this part of the world, or in this industry, or in this organization. Or maybe it is wrong, but, you know, it's really above my pay grade. It's not my responsibility. Or maybe it's wrong, but if I try and do something, I will probably be unsuccessful, and I may make it worse, if not for everyone else, certainly for my own career. So all of these things would come out in the conversation. Their thinking would be far more complicated. I actually think that's a good thing, right? You don't want people to walk into situations naively. You want them to really understand. But the second thing that happened I would find kind of a bit more troubling. I would usually find, whether I was in a classroom with students or whether I was in a room with a bunch of managers, is that there usually were one or two people that when they spoke, everyone would turn to listen to them. These were usually the people who were maybe the most articulate, maybe they were the people who always had a witty story to illustrate their point of view. For whatever reason, those people, the ones that everyone listened to, were usually the ones in these conversations who would raise their hands and they'd say, you know, Mary, I know what you want me to say, but in the real world it's not possible to do that. So it's a little troubling when the people everyone's listening to are the ones who are voicing the most skeptical, if not cynical, positions. So I felt like students were walking out, or managers were walking out of these ethics discussions, both you know, more confused. That might be a good thing. You want them to think, you know, broadly, but also less empowered. And I thought, you know, that's not, you know, life is short. I want to do something that matters. I don't think I'm making an impact here that's helpful. And so for all those reasons, I had my crisis of faith, and I decided I'm going to take a step back from this work. I want to do something that I can feel better about. And around that time, I had an experience that, one of the experiences that helped lead to the creation of Giving Voice to Values. And it was basically, I got invited to do a consulting project at Columbia Business School in New York. And I was there working on one project, but while I was there were a group of faculty, about 5 or 6 faculty, finance, strategy, public management, who were still working on this issue of ethics and MBA education. And They knew about my past work at Harvard, so they said, Mary, would you take a look at what we're doing? I said, sure. So this is what they were doing. Not my idea, their idea, but I want to share it with you because it's interesting. They were asking all of the incoming MBA students, so at the time that was about 600 students, upon matriculation, during orientation, they were asking them to answer one question. And this was a question. They'd say, tell us about a time in your work experience so far when you were explicitly told or implicitly pressured to do something that conflicted with your own values, and how you handled it. And they were asked to just write it down, just a paragraph, put it, don't put their names on it, don't name the organization. So they collected, hundreds of these little stories, right? And they said, Mary, do you want to read these? So I said, sure. So I did read hundreds of them, well over 1,000 over several years, and they were really interesting, and we learned a few things. So I want to share some of the things we learned. The first thing we learned is that you could probably, if you think about who goes to a school like Columbia for an MBA, at that time anyways, most of them had on average 4 or 5 years of work experience. So the first thing we learned was that you could probably count on one hand the number of people who said I was never asked to do something that conflicted with my values. They pretty much all had a story to tell. That was the first thing we learned. The second thing we learned is, again, if you think about the kinds of people who go to a business school like Columbia, it's in New York City, certain industries are more heavily represented than others. So, a lot of people from the financial sector, a lot of people from big pharma, because so many of the multinational pharmaceutical companies have headquarters there. A good number of people from high tech. There were a lot of people from the big consulting firms, So because certain industries were more heavily represented, the kinds of stories they told got repetitious really quickly. So they talked about things like, I was told to inflate or deflate my billable hours in a way that didn't correspond with work I was doing. Or I was told to tamper with or adjust the equations and benchmarks I used to evaluate the relative attractiveness or lack of attractiveness of a particular financial transaction in order to encourage my clients to take the action that would maximize revenue from my employer. Or I was told to exaggerate, to puff up the capabilities of a new product, a new piece of software, a new pharmaceutical product, beyond what our research data could definitely establish in order to maximize sales revenue. They talked about, especially the multinationals, but not exclusively them, would talk about pressures to engage in various forms of corruption, paying bribes, facilitating payments, in order to gain access to a certain market or to be able to compete effectively in that market. And then there were always the ubiquitous human resource issues around hiring and firing and fairness and discrimination. So the stories got repetitious really quickly. What was interesting is that their answers differed, their responses differed, and they fell into some recognizable buckets. So the first bucket, the largest bucket, a little less than half of them said, yes, I had a values conflict and it bothered me. It didn't just roll off my back. But I really didn't think I had any choice. So I just sucked it up and did what they told me to do. That was the largest group, a little less than half. And then there was a small group who said, yeah, I had a values conflict. It bothered me so much. I couldn't bring myself to do it. But I also couldn't think of any options. So these people removed themselves from the situation. They got themselves transferred to a different work group or a different boss. But some of them even quit their jobs. But this was a small group. Now the remainder of the whole group, so now we're talking about a third of them, said, yes, I had a values conflict, and I tried to do something about it. And a small group of those people said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried, and by my lights, I was successful. So we were thinking, gee, this is kind of interesting. These people are describing the same kinds of scenarios, are often talking about the same organizations. They all got into Columbia Business School, so you have some level of ability. Why is it that some of them are able to do this effectively and others are not? So even though it wasn't really research data, it was self-reporting, but we thought it was interesting, it was provocative. So we thought we'd take a closer look at it because maybe there'd be some string we could pull, some lever we could push that would help from a pedagogical point of view, from a teaching point of view. So we we got a researcher in and had them slice and dice the stories and look for patterns and themes. And in the end, you know, she couldn't say that one group was more morally troubled than the other group. Because by definition, we had them define the values conflict. It wasn't like I told them, here's a story, and some of them thought that it was important and others didn't. And it wasn't that one group was more organizationally sophisticated, you know, or politically savvy, because some of the folks who found ways to effectively act on their values were in fact very clever and came up with these sort of ingenious win-wins. But some of them were kind of clumsy and even naive in the way they did it. So in the end, the only thing we could say is that the people who had acted on their values in these circumstances at some point had said something outside of their own heads. And it might have started out by talking to a spouse or a partner or a friend, but eventually it found its way into the organization and changed the trajectory of things. So when I heard that, I went back to my crisis of faith because I thought, there's nothing I can do with that. That's not helpful. And I was a little discouraged. But then I remembered something. I remembered some research I had seen years earlier when I was still at Harvard. And it was 2 different studies by 2 different scholars who independently decided they wanted to research what they were calling moral courage and altruism. But basically what they were looking at is people who had acted with great conviction in times of high risk, high stakes. And both of these scholars, Douglas Hunnicky and Perry London, independently decided that the way they would pursue this research, it was qualitative research, is that they would identify people, the population who's often known as rescuers from World War II. So these are people who put their lives at stake during the Holocaust to help others. And they would interview them in depth to see, do they have any common history, common education, common family background, common experiences that might give us some insight into what kinds of people act this way in under these high-risk situations. So, you know, they did these qualitative interviews, in-depth interviews, and they did come up with a list of characteristics, most of which I don't remember. But there was one characteristic that kind of resonated with me when I first read these studies, and it came back to me now. And it was this. They said that the people who'd acted with this kind of conviction in these high-risk situations all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult, they had had the experience with someone more senior to them. So a boss, a teacher, a mentor, even a parent. They'd had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if, and then various kinds of values conflicts. So they'd actually kind of pre-scripted themselves, but what they had done, it was at both the cognitive or the intellectual level, but also at the behavioral level. So at the cognitive level, they'd actually identified the values that mattered to them and put an articulation to it, a kind of script to it. But at the experiential or behavioral level, they literally voiced it out loud to someone more senior to them who stood in as proxy for the kind of person they might need to talk to in these actual circumstances. So it was, you know, they couldn't have anticipated the Holocaust, but there was this kind of expression of a moral identity that they engaged in. So it was this idea of rehearsal, this idea of voice that was interesting to me. So when I remembered that, I started doing 2 kinds of exploration. The first kind was I gathered more stories. You know, like the stories that the Columbia students wrote, I started interviewing people, everyone from, you know, students all the way up to C-suite executives. And we gathered stories. We basically asked them that question. You know, tell us about a time when your values conflicted with what you felt pressured to do and how you handled it. So we gathered stories of times when they had been able to act effectively and times when they had not. And the other kind of exploration we did is we looked at the research. What do we know in the research? And at that point, this was about 8 or 9 years ago, there was starting to be more and more research, there's actually more now, from a number of different disciplines that suggested that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal, pre-scripting, practice, peer coaching are very important ways to do it. So in the field of social psychology, you've probably seen some of the popularizations of research on things like habit formation. There's also a school of thought in psychology. The folks are often called, the work they do is often called the study of positive deviance. These are the people who look at folks who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. And the folks who do that research have an interesting phrase. It's their phrase, not mine, a guy named Jeffrey Stern. And he says, if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more effective to ask them to act their way into a different way of thinking. There's increasing research in the field of psychology around practice rehearsal. The field of cognitive neuroscience, which is not my field, but I talked to folks who are experts, and they were telling me about more and more research around brain plasticity and creating new neural pathways, and the work of Antonio Damasio that was also suggesting this idea of rehearsal, repetition. But the research that I found most compelling as a way to crystallize this idea came from the field of kinesthetics, study of physical movement. So I'm going to share this story with you now because I think it will help you remember and understand the idea of what I'm talking about. So back in the day, when I first started at Harvard Business School, I decided I wanted to take a self-defense class. Now, I had never in my life felt the need to take a self-defense class until I went to work at Harvard Business School. I think they might be connected. And so I looked around Boston. There were a lot of these courses. They all taught pretty much the same thing. They would teach you the physical moves, fist to bridge of nose, and heel to instep, and knee to groin, and they'd have you practice these moves in the air. And the idea was, now if anyone ever attacks me, I know what to do. But there was one course that was different. It was called model mugging. And it was a developmental model, so they would still teach you all the moves in the air. But then once you knew them, they'd bring in a guy in a padded suit, you know this stuff? And it was like the Michelin Man, right? And we would stand in a line and we'd wait your turn to get attacked. And you could use these moves on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning it was kind of ludicrous because you just waited your turn to get attacked. But as the course went on, week after week, I'd be talking to you and he'd come and grab me. I never knew when, I never knew what hold he was going to use. It was utterly nerve-wracking. But the idea behind it that they explained to us, and those of you who are athletes will be familiar with this, was this idea of specific state muscle memory. So the idea is if you rehearse something in the same physiological and cognitive and emotional state that you will be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze, your body remembers. So, you know, the tennis champion practices her serve over and over before she goes to tournament, so that when she's under those high-stakes situations, even if she's so tense, her body automatically assumes the proper form. So, one day, I'm lying on my back on the floor, having failed to protect myself, and I was thinking, gee, you know, could we create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could we create a default to voice, but not just to speaking up, but to informed voice? Because what I was learning from all these conversations with people who had or had not found ways to act on their values effectively, the ones who had done so effectively, you know, the kinds of objections you would face got repetitious very quickly, but there were responses to them, and they usually were not stamping your foot and shaking your fist and speaking truth to power in a kind of confrontational way. These people usually were applying all the same kinds of problem solving and influence skills and negotiation skills and reframing of challenges and empathy in terms of understanding perspectives. They were applying all of the same skills, those skills that they would use in any other business endeavor. They were applying them to ethics. One of the things I found over and over is that when we approach ethics, I see this in school and I see it in organizations, we tend to often frame it as if it's entirely a cognitive issue, that we have to help people understand where the issues are and think through the thorny issues. That is important. I'm not saying it's not. But quite often, what people really need is the opportunity. They recognize the issue, but they don't feel that there are any options. They don't feel comfortable. And we're also learning from the research, a lot of the social psychology research, is that because at some level we expect it's going to be hard or impossible to act on our values, that we end up kind of acting first out of emotion and then post hoc rationalizing that it was actually the right thing to do. There's some interesting research about this, and you know, it's because we don't want to sit in that place of cognitive dissonance, you know, of knowing something was wrong and doing it anyways. This all happens at the unconscious level. It's not that we choose to rationalize in that way, but there's this sort of instinctive sense that we're going to act out of the emotion first and then rationalize later. So I started thinking, gee, we're learning that rehearsal is important. We're learning that prescripting is important. We're learning that practice is important. What is it that we rehearse and prescript and practice in business ethics education? And then I got all depressed all over again because what we typically would do, what I would do, what we would probably proclaim is that we teach awareness and we teach analysis. And this was true both in corporate settings and in business schools. So in awareness, when we're teaching awareness, what we mean is we're going to expose you to a lot of scenarios of the kinds of ethical issues you might encounter so that you'll recognize them when you see them. This is hugely important. It's necessary. You know, we live in a world where it's complicated. It's global business, technology is developing. The kinds of challenges we're facing are you know, accelerating, and they're not always what we're expecting. But it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Because a lot of the kinds of scenarios I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks are times when a lot of people knew something was wrong. The stuff, the scandals that hit the press, people just didn't think they had any choices. So although awareness is important, it's not enough. The other thing we would do is we teach analysis. What this means is we're going to teach you how to reason through these scenarios so that you will do so rigorously and consistently and appropriately. So in the corporate setting, this meant we would teach you the relevant laws and regulations and the corporate policies and values, and you'd look at a scenario and decide, is it over the line or not? In an academic setting, what we would do is we'd teach you the models of ethical reasoning that come from philosophy, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, and we'd give you a scenario and invite you to reason through it that way. Again, hugely important. You don't want to just assume that your knee-jerk reaction is the right one. But again, not sufficient. And I think the best way to illustrate that is through another little story. I told you I interviewed a lot of executives. One of the guys I interviewed was a CEO and an entrepreneur, very successful, at his own consumer products firm based in the US, privately held. And I went to talk to him, and he said, Mary, I want to tell you a story. He said, I recently interviewed a new MBA graduate from one of the top US business schools. I was thinking about hiring him for my firm, and I asked him, did you take a business ethics class in your MBA program? And the guy said, well, yeah, it was required. And so the CEO said, what did you learn? And the kid said, or the gentleman said, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics. And then I learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict, you decide what you want to do. And then you select the model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do. Now, of course, this was not what the professor intended the student to walk away with, and this CEO was kind of smirking at me. You know, he was kind of yanking my chain because I was the ethics lady. But you know, there's a certain amount of truth to this, right? These models of reasoning by design conflict. That's why they're valuable, because what you see from a consequentialist perspective, you might miss from a duty-based perspective. So that's why they're useful, but they don't tell you what's right. And once you know what's right, they certainly don't tell you how to get it done. So if you're talking about this idea of rehearsal, if they're not used in a broad enough context, these kinds of models of reasoning can become a kind of schooling for sophistry. The students can basically learn to rationalize anything. So what I realized is awareness and analysis are both important and necessary, but we need to add the third A, which is action. We need to give people an opportunity to rehearse, to practice, to prescript, and peer coach values-driven action. And that meant we needed a different pedagogical technology. We call it the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment. So instead of creating the traditional case studies, I used to run the case writing program at Harvard. I've written many case studies that have gone platinum, and you all know what those are like. They're 15 pages long, and they feature a CEO who at the end of the case looks out the window and says, what should I do? And the people discuss it. It's a great way to teach awareness and analysis. Not a great way to teach action. The GVV thought experiments is still a scenario-based pedagogy or training, but the cases are very short, they're often just a paragraph or two. They feature people at every level of the organization, because as we learned from those Columbia students, you start having these challenges right away, So we have CEOs and we have, people right out of school. But the big difference is these scenarios end with the protagonist who has already decided what he or she believes the right thing to do is. And the question is, how can they get it done effectively? And the students work in teams to come up with scripts and action plans and to anticipate the kinds of objections they're going to encounter and then to think about ways to respond to them. And we've created a full curriculum around this. We've identified the most frequently heard, we call them reasons and rationalizations for less than ethical behavior. We've identified a lot of the research from social psychology that helps people think about how can you reframe problems and how can you give people tools to create actionable scripts. We've created hundreds of cases and exercises and readings and online materials. Anyways, we created all this stuff, we put it online for free. And we said, play with it, pilot it, experiment with it. Does this help? And we were frankly kind of stunned at the rapidity with which, and the extension of the application and the take-up. As Kyle said, we don't know everyone who's using it because we give it away for free, but I do keep track of everyone who writes to me, and that's well over, I guess at this point it's close to 950 schools and companies and organizations on all 7 continents, and it keeps growing all the time. We've started working with a number of major corporations, Unilever, Lockheed Martin, Prudential. I was just talking to the American Development Bank today. So that's been an interesting development. I'm going to conclude, because I think we want time for some questions, but I want to just conclude with a couple points. You've probably figured out that GVV is basically just a reframe. Instead of asking what's right, we ask how do you get the right thing done. And we say that at the heart of it are the 3 GVV flips, or the 3 GVV reversals. We've reversed what it is we think we're talking about when we talk about business ethics. We've reversed who we think we're talking to and how we're having the conversation. So what, who, and how. So at the what level, typically, if you talk to people about ethics, especially business ethics, people would always say to me, Mary, don't bother with the so-called clear-cut black and white issues. Focus on the gray issues, the real ethical dilemmas. That's where it's valuable, because those are the ones where people don't know what's right. And I used to think that was right, that was the way to go, but I've actually changed my mind. I mean, there obviously are a lot of gray issues, and I don't know what the right answer is to most of them. But the thing is, those are usually issues where reasonable people of goodwill and intelligence can legitimately disagree. That's why they're gray. But there nevertheless are a lot of issues where most of us, not everybody, but most of us would agree, that's over the line. That's clearly fraudulent, it's abusive, it's illegal, whatever. But just because most of us agree to that doesn't mean we think there's a way that we could act if we're being pressured to do the thing that we're uncomfortable with. So what we've decided is, let's focus on those so-called black and white issues. And actually ask people the GVV thought experiment. What if you were going to act here? How could you get it done effectively? Because if we focus on the gray issues, we never get past the conversation about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. We just can't get to action. But if we focus on the so-called clear-cut issues, we can have that conversation about action. And ironically, it often makes us better at talking about the gray issues. The other thing that I've learned, and I was having this conversation at West Point with some folks who design ethics for the U.S. Army, is they were saying, it's interesting how many so-called clear-cut issues people will say are gray. And, I said the reason for that, I think, is because they don't think they can act on them. And so rather than sit in that place of discomfort and cognitive dissonance, I'm going to kind of explain to myself that it's really not that clear, And so what we're trying to do is to help people truly practice that action piece. So that's the what. We've also reversed who it is we think we're talking to when it comes to ethics. So it used to be I'll go into a school or a company and they'd say, Mary, most of the people here are good people. We just took a few bad apples. And those are the ones the training is for. I've changed my mind about how I think of the audience, and this is based on some research research that was done by the late Greg Dees, who's a friend of mine from my Harvard days, and a colleague of his, Peter Crampton. And they wrote about ethics and negotiations, and they posited this idea. Other people have talked about it as well. But what we do is we premise that the organization, that the classroom, the business is like a bell curve. And at one tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as opportunists. And we would define opportunists as people who say, I'll do whatever it takes to maximize my self-interest. That is the damn. Now, nobody falls into one of these categories all the time, but these are people who say, you know, I'm primarily motivated consciously and intentionally by material self-interest. And at the other tail end of the bell curve are the folks who we would identify, who would self-identify as idealists. These are the folks who say, I'll always try and act on my values, regardless of the impact on my material self-interest. What we premise is that the majority of people in the organization or in the classroom fall under the bell. We call them pragmatists. I put myself there. And we define pragmatists as people who would say, I would like to act on my values, as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying as long as I know I'll never pay a price. It's not the same as saying as long as I know I will succeed, because you don't. It simply means I think I have a shot. You know, any business endeavor you get into, you don't know you're going to be profitable, you don't know you're going to succeed, but you pursue the ideas that you think have a chance of being successful. So what we're trying to do with GBV, I don't really think I change the opportunists. I think they'll always be with us. And I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I want them to become more skillful. But we're trying to actually appeal to the pragmatists and say, we want to give you the skills, we want to give you the literal scripts, the tools, the positive examples, and the rehearsal, the peer coaching, to be who you already want to be at your best. We're not trying to change you, we're trying to enable you to do this effectively. And our theory is that if more of the idealists and the pragmatists became more skillful at this, you're actually changing the water that the opportunists are swimming in. So the calculus they do for what is truly opportunistic and what they will get away with has changed. And the last flip is how we do all this, and I've already explained that to you. Instead of asking what's right, we ask how do you get the right thing done. So that's GBV in a nutshell. I've told you the story in an academic setting, but as I said, it's now being used in a lot of organizations. I also find a lot of people just find it useful in their own lives in terms of how they think about these issues. So I'll stop there. I think we have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions, comments, suggestions. But I really appreciate your listening. I love telling the story of GBV, and thank you very much. So are there any questions, comments, suggestions? Yeah?
I have a question. Have you found any evidence that suggests that the practice itself, no matter what setting, is what is important, or is it practice in settings where there are real consequences to their actions? Meaning, like, is the role playing and where you're in a consequence-free environment helpful, or is it where, like, people who, because your evidence was just like a snapshot, right? One person's story. Like, you can imagine maybe like the people who have been put in like 10 different scenarios finally figure out a way to do it, and then they act correctly, and maybe that's the story they shared. And so I'm just wondering if if you found any evidence of the difference.
So I guess that's a great question. So I guess I'll say, first of all, when I would interview people, I'd often go to them because someone said, oh, you should talk to him or her, they've got a great story to tell about acting on their values. And people would say, yeah, I'll tell you that story, but often they'd say, but I'll only tell you that story if you also let me tell you about a time when I didn't act on my values. Because people wanted to be honest. They didn't want to pretend that they were heroes or that this was easy. So I kind of would get lots of stories, you know, and then I would ask them, well, clearly you care about this. Why didn't you act on your values when you didn't? And they'd almost always say, because I didn't think I had a choice. I didn't think I had an option. And so that's part of what we were trying to do with GBV, is help people feel like they had more arrows in their quiver, they had more options. But to get to your question about sort of consequence-free practice, it's interesting. A lot of times people will hear me talk about GBV and they'll think I'm just talking about kind of traditional adversarial role-playing. And that's actually not at all what we're talking about. And I'll tell you a brief little story. Back when I was at Columbia, there was a professor there who was a terrifically smart, articulate, very quick, guy. And he also cared very much about ethics. So he sort of identified all these scenarios based on those student stories, and then he picked a few of them, and he went into a classroom with a bunch of students, I was there, and he would invite them to voice the sort of ethical perspective, and he would play the bad guy, you know, whether it was the boss or the customer or whoever, you know, the villain. He was so quick, and he was so sharp, and he was so intense, and, you know, a few students would raise their hand and start doing it, and then they'd get into this adversarial role play, and they would very quickly be shut down, right? And he was trying to teach them through this kind of simulation, this sort of flight simulator model about how hard this was, but what it actually, and his intentions were excellent. I mean, I love this guy. But what he was actually doing is basically teaching everyone not to speak about this stuff because you're just going to get squashed, right? And it's a lot more fun and a lot easier often to come up with the villain's voice, right? So what I realized is that there may be a value for that kind of adversarial role play, but that's not where you start. This is a developmental model. So we start out saying, you know, basically we want everyone to engage in this peer coaching and pre-scripting and enhancing and perfecting the approach. So what we'll do to people is we'll say it's the GBV thought experiment. I'm not asking you what you would do. I'm asking what if you were this person who has decided this is right, how could they get it done? So we all work together on that, and then we present it to the group, whether it's in a company or whether it's in a classroom, and we ask people, is this convincing? And so some of the things will say, yeah, that was clever, but some of them will say, no, that would never work. And so then your idea is not to just squash it, but to say, well, how would you make it better? So we have everybody, for the sake of this exercise, trying to create a script and an action plan for acting on the values-based position that is just as powerful. Now, after you've done that a few times, you may want to then move to an adversarial role play. Or not, I mean, life is an adversarial role play, but you may want to go there. But we don't start there, because what we find is it just stops people from developing. Does that help? Yeah?
So is anyone doing research or follow-up on people who had the GBV training as to whether it's impactful and whether you're having different outcomes?
Yes, that's beginning to happen now. It's kind of exciting to me, and I'm hoping there will be more. I think there are people who are looking at more. And in fact, I just moved to the University of Virginia, and we're hoping to raise some funds to catalyze more of this. But I'll tell you two examples. One happened on the corporate side, and one was on the academic side. So on the corporate side, the company that's been using this the longest, for 6 or 7 years now, is Lockheed Martin, the defense contract. They've been using it with, you know, they have 120,000 employees, something like that, all over the world. And they started recently putting some questions in their employee survey that are kind of not around GBVs per se, but are around, you know, voicing your values, acting on your values, what happens. And I was talking to them a few months ago, and they said it's early days, but what they think they're gathering from this data is that, number one, people are reporting that they're raising issues more, but they're also saying, you know, Lockheed is a defense contractor, government contractor, so they have lots of rules, lots of laws. So they have a lot of ethics officers, right? And so what they were finding is that people were coming to the ethics officer with these issues, but instead of what they would do in the past is dump it in your lap and say, you take care of it. You know, the ethics officer as the police. What they were now finding is people were coming to them and saying, there's something going on in my office, I don't think it's appropriate. I'd like to handle it. Will you work with me to create a script and an action plan so that I'll be more effective? From Lockheed's perspective, this was great because they were getting the data, because sometimes it was a mandatory reporting situation anyways. But they were also felt like this was more like true culture change, right? This isn't just dumping it in someone else's lap. I want to have an impact on my colleague, my boss, my customer. So that was the first finding. The second finding is that they were learning that when people did bring issues to the ethics officer for investigation, they were more likely to be issues that actually required investigation, as opposed to the kind of false positives, you know, where people just start complaining, you know.
Right.
So from their perspective, it was a more efficient use of the ethics officers, it was more culture change, and it was, you know, also more effective. So that was on the corporate side. On the academic side, there was an interesting example. It's a couple of accounting professors, right? They're at a small school in the Northwest in the U.S., and these two professors were very committed to ethics, and of course, there are now requirements to become a CPA that you take ethics and accounting courses. So they had worked very intensely and genuinely with their undergraduate accounting majors, sophomore, junior, senior year, to introduce ethics. In senior year, they gave students an assignment. Do this assignment, submit your answer online, and then go visit this website. But don't go to the website until you've submitted your answer, because it will affect your answer. Of course, everybody went to the website before they handed in their paper, and the faculty were devastated. You know, they've been working on ethics for 3 years, and that was when I met them, right around that time. And so they experimented for the next 3 years, building GBB into the academy. They ran the experiment when the kids were seniors. None of them went to the website before they turned in their assignment. And you can't say that this is necessarily because of GBB, because, you know, it's kind of correlative rather than causal, but it's certainly provocative, you know. So those are two examples. I could share others. We have anecdotal things, but those, I think, kind of capture what we're working on. Some other, and they just published an article about this, by the way, so if anyone's interested, email me and I'll send it to you. Other questions or comments or suggestions? Yeah, Kyle.
So it's interesting. I can't remember what word you used at the end there, but you said after going through this kind of thing, it tends to bubble up in terms of the idealists and the pragmatists are better at this than people send this, which is just interesting because it seems to me a lot of times we tend to think of ethics from, you know, in a company that this has to be a kind of top-down approach, and once the leaders do it. So you found this eventually leads to a significant culture change at the leadership level, or is it mostly, at this point, been something that works for individuals within the program?
It's a great question. So, I mean, obviously, you can have leadership that screws everything up, right? And you can have leadership that supports values and ethics in an organization. But when people say you can never be ethical unless you have ethical leadership, it kind of means a lot of us are just off luck, you know? And so I find that a kind of defeatist perspective. And so it's interesting to me, the organizations that have come to me, often they'll say, well, you don't need to work with the senior folk, because they wouldn't have gotten to be at the top of the organization if they didn't know how to voice their values. But then we actually find that they start getting interested. I have two examples. One was we did some work with McKinsey, the consulting firm, and they invited me to Berlin to meet with a group of about 80 or 90 of their senior partners, not because we were going to teach the senior partners about GBB, but because they were the faculty, quote unquote, who were going to teach the approach to the other consultants. And what was interesting is in the course of the session, they themselves started recognizing, hey, this is kind of important for us, not because we don't know what's right, but because we're often in situations where it's my senior partner colleague that I have to influence, and I need to be able to get along with him or her and work with him or her, and so this is really difficult, so it's useful to have this exercise. So they, even though we were teaching them for another reason, started to understand that. But the best example I have is what happened in Nigeria with Unilever. Unilever asked me to come in and do a program, not for their senior leaders, but for their middle managers. And then we were going to work with a group of about 35 sort of change champions, you know, selected middle managers, and then they were going to go, it was train the trainer, they were going to then train the rest of the team. And I was supposed to just come in and do like a couple-hour GBB light for the senior leaders, just so they'd know what was going on, but not because they needed the training. But a month or so before I showed up in Lagos for the second time, I got a phone call from the guy at Unilever who hired me, and he said, we've been thinking about maybe we should do this differently. Maybe we should have the senior leaders in the room with the change champions, which I thought was a great idea, but I was pretty scared, you know, because I didn't know if this could work at all. But this is what we did. It was really interesting. We had the whole senior leadership team for Nigeria Unilever, which was about a dozen folk. And then we had this group of about 35 selected middle managers who were then going to roll it out to the, you know, many other employees. And we had them in the room at the same time. They'd all gone through the same sort of preparatory work online. And we did the introductory work about what is GBV and some exercises. And then we got to the GBV scenarios. And what we did is we put the senior leaders at their own tables. There were a couple tables of senior leaders. And then we had maybe 5 or 6 tables of middle managers. We asked the middle managers to look at the scenarios in a traditional GBV way, which was, you know, how can I raise this issue in a way that's going to be effective and make change? But we asked the senior leaders to look at the same scenario and say, how could a middle manager bring this issue to me in a way that would make it easier for me to respond effectively? So this kind of had the impact of both requiring them to reflect on whether or not they actually listen when people raise these issues, but also to think about, how could I listen better? How could I be more effective? What would make it easier? So then when we brought them together for the debrief, there was this kind of natural social contracting that started to take place, you know, and this was not my idea. They came up with this idea of creating what they called the GBV deal. And it was a one-page thing with like 3 commitments that the senior leaders are making and 3 commitments that the middle managers are making. It was basically, I commit to listen and take it seriously if you will present the issues in these ways. And they asked for some specific things. And they all sort of signed this and made this commitment. And now they're taking it further. They actually have a social media communication where they're sharing examples of how this happened. So to me, what I've learned from working with organizations is that it's important to talk at the senior leadership level, but I need to frame it differently. Partly just because of their egos. So when I talk to senior leadership, I say, A, you still need to, you know, rehearsal and pre-scripting is still powerful and helpful to you, but you're often voicing your values to your senior peers as opposed to talking to your boss. It's not that they don't have bosses, but they will listen to you more if you talk about this collegial talking to your senior peers. The second thing we talk about is if you're a leader, you're responsible for creating a culture that will enable this kind of voice. But the one we get the biggest traction is the third one, where we say, if you're a leader, you can use the same sort of rehearsal, practice, peer coaching, scripting to think about how do I hear it when people bring these issues to me? How can I respond in a way that will assure them that I'm taking it seriously, even though I'm going to need to do my own due diligence? Because often middle managers will think they're just being brushed off when you tell them that, and they will be disillusioned and feel like I'm not going to raise these issues because no one's listening. So we just have learned we need to frame it differently with leadership, but it is important. Anything else? I would like to encourage people, if you're curious about this, you can just go to www.givingvoicetovalues.org and you'll find all kinds of information. You'll find links to the curriculum. Like I say, it's all free. You'll find links to the books. You'll find information about the online materials and videos and my email address, and you're all invited to be in touch if you have questions. And there's books. And Anne, do you want to say something?
So, if you could you give an example? Let's say, you know, the recent scandal with Wells Fargo, in the way that that corporate culture encouraged a certain type of behavior that compromised, well, you know, a lot of people's values. They were at really odds with what they had to do, but felt like they had to do it. How would giving voice to values help a company like that, or a situation like that?
Yeah. So in a situation like Wells Fargo, and I don't have any special knowledge of that, but I've been reading the papers, as we all have. My understanding is that what was happening is that they created a set of incentives that were measuring certain kinds of bottom line things in terms of numbers of accounts opened, etc. But they weren't measuring anything around the process or how these things happen, and they weren't actually paying attention to that. And there was a lot of sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you know, kind of deciding not to see things. So what that made me think of, and now in the wake of the scandal, people are saying, you know, we had the wrong incentives. What it made me think of is a story when I was working with a group of business school faculty in Australia. They told me this story. They said they had a group of MBA students who did an internship in a financial sector firm, a firm that managed the portfolios of high net worth individuals. And what the students found is that the incentives in this organization were set up in such a way that the employees and the portfolio managers there were incentivized to simply churn their clients' portfolios, which meant they gathered more fees. It didn't, and it worked to the detriment of the clients, which is a kind of similar scenario, even though the issue was different. And the students were there to do an internship, right, for credit, and the internship had nothing to do with that, but they observed this, right, while they were there, and they had just taken their GBV course, and so they went to the faculty and they said, we think this is wrong. And so what they did is they did a GBV analysis and created a kind of presentation and then a script, and they asked permission to share it with the management and the firm actually listened to them and put together a task force to re-examine the incentive structure within the organization. Now this was at a smaller scale, it was a smaller organization, but the idea behind it is that with GBV, what we would hope for there is that, this is a case where there clearly were some individuals who knew what was going on and were just, they were going to do this. But what we always say with GBV is that there are issues where they're individual to individual. You ask me to cheat or lie, and then I need to figure out how to talk to you. But there are other issues that are more systemic. This was more of a systemic issue, right?
The Wells Fargo.
Mm-hmm. And if there's systemic issues, it's not one person who talks to one person who fixes it. They have to be addressed at a systemic level, like change the incentive structure. And so people will often say, therefore you can't do anything as an individual. I hear this all the time when I go to India and China and Africa and Middle East. They'll talk about South America. They'll talk about bribery and corruption in climates where there's a lot of that. And they'll kind of say it's a systemic issue.
And it's accepted too.
Yes, it's accepted, it's a norm, but it's systemic. So even if you don't like it, even if you don't accept it, as many of the people in those places don't, I mean, I go there all the time, they don't feel like there are any options. And so what I would say is just saying it's systemic doesn't mean that you can't change it. The thing is that it has to be addressed systemically, but it's only individual actions that start to lead to that systemic change. Well, what people need to understand is that you're not going to fix it overnight. It's going to be incremental. You're going to have to build allies. You're going to have 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You're going to have to be very practical and pragmatic. So if you were in an organization like Wells Fargo, I think you have to understand this is systemic. And it's probably going to take a bit of time. And it's not going to be something, people often think that GBV is about whistleblowing. Your Wells Fargo, you just go blow the whistle. Actually, I developed GBV because the research suggests that whistleblowing is so costly. It's costly for the whistleblower, it's costly for the organization. So what we wanted to say was, look, there are times when whistleblowing is essential. Lives are at stake, time is short. But really, what you want to do is help people figure out ways to begin to raise these issues before it gets to that point, so that you can, in fact, make changes in a more natural and a more organizationally resilient way. And so that's really what we would say was something that Wells Fargo. Now, I don't have any particular insight into that organization, but that would be the way we would begin to approach that. Any other comments or questions? I think we're at the end of the time, are we? Or should we? Yeah. But I really appreciate you guys coming. And if you have any other thoughts, or if you want to visit the website or email me, please feel free. And thank you very much.
Yeah.